I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Happy Heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.com. Formerly known as Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, we've been awakening divine sparks, entering now 9 years, and since 2006. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not for a better world, but helping you build better inner worlds. We're not for or against any cause, except causing an inner alchemical transformation that will help you reach the potential you have been searching for throughout many reincarnations in many worlds.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
You do this through gnosis, that salvific knowledge, that heavy metal thunder revelation, that knowledge of the heart and knowledge of the broken heart of the world's soul. It's not an easy task, and it was Edmund Lupriere who said, "Ears to hear, eyes to see. That is the great tragedy of the Gnostic." And it was Chris Knowles who wrote, "The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it saddles you with a burden you can never escape. So choose very carefully where you decide to start digging and what dragons you choose to slay. Prepare to be taken places you never wanted to go. Gnosis isn't always a flower. Sometimes it's a sword. Maybe more often than not."
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
You will see this quote is very appropriate with this week's show, with Mark Gregory Pegg on the reality of the Cathars. Nonetheless, one way to alleviate the burden that is saddled with you for stealing fire from the gods is by giving it away. I've always said it's not gnosis if you can't give it away. Gnosis is that divine virus or plasmate Philip K. Dick spoke about. Gnosis entails expression and alleviation to others.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share, undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Welcome, you lords of deconstruction, you revenge of the myth, and you words made on flesh. Welcome, you Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, you jaded mandarins, you veterans of 1,000 psychic wars. The Sufi poet Rabia encapsulated our sacred and profane quest when she wrote, "I carry a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. With these things I am going to set fire to heaven and put out the flames of hell, so that voyagers to God can rip the veils and see their real goal."
It's been a brilliant journey of self-awakening. Now you've simply got to ask yourself this: what is happiness to you?
I am Abraxas in his meat machine incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting in the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis. I hope you understand that I bring you ancient but perennial liberating heresy, those contraband truths of the Gnostics, through mainly a literary lens. Our war is not a spiritual war, an ideas war, or even a political war. Our war is an artistic one, and that's where our ultimate liberation lies, our tikkun olam. The meaning of life is to give meaning to a mechanistic cold universe. And we do this through our imagination, our invention, our myth-making, our intellectual exploration, and our pushing the buttons of the god of this world and his butt slaves in the establishment.
And they haven't given us any other options outside the occasional purely symbolic participatory act of voting. You want the puppet on the right or the puppet on the left?
We will be victorious even as the hordes of hell and marketing gurus and social media sirens bear down upon us in the battlefields of the true seeker warrior Kabir wrote about. Like the Gnostic-minded W.B. Yeats said, whatever we build in the imagination will accomplish itself in the circumstances of our lives. Everything I've just said, babbled about, and quoted truly can be summarized in one sentence. Write your own gospel and live your own myth.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
What a show we have on this mid-May, the year of our Demiurge 2015. As we truly understand that the truth doesn't always set you free, at least not in the beginning, and how Gnosis is a sword. As mentioned, our astral guest is Mark Gregory Pegg, author of The Corruption of Angels, the Great Inquisition of 1245 to 1246, and author of Most Holy War, the Albigensian Crusade and the Battle for Christendom, as well as professor of medieval history at Washington University. Mark will be relating his lofty and penetrating ideas that he gave at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference at Rice University, which I attended along with other past guests of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. He will aver that the Cathars actually never existed. They were a figment of heresy hunters and romance hunters and occult hunter S. Thompsons. Sounds shocking, but nothing as shocking as Jane's Addiction sang. And you will soon hear the sober argument from an excellent scholar with no axe to grind, except against erroneous history.
You can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
No worries on this from a true seeker warrior standpoint. From a literary/Gnostic standpoint. Maybe there were no Cathars, like there were never any Rosicrucians, or Illuminati as we know them. Maybe there is no Gnosticism. Maybe there is no Buddhism, Hinduism, or even Christianity or Judaism, as there were really only Christianities and Judaisms. Plural messes, as Dylan Burns argues in Apocalypse of the Alien God. Maybe all of them are just a human desire to find meaning in the darkness of mere historical being.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.
But I did speak about the meaning of life, and projecting meaning is sometimes all we can do against the Archons. All history is fiction, Alan Moore wrote. And James Joyce wrote, history is a nightmare I'm trying to wake up from. And I've certainly mentioned two of the main rules of Gnosticism. Nothing is what it seems, and everything you've been told is a lie. Oh, And thirdly, I've also mentioned that there is always a new layer of truth, a new Aeon to reach. And you must discard the dirty rags that is your identity with each new level. We continue together through so many levels, fueled by our imaginations that expand our divine spark and traverse the many dimensions of consciousness and awareness and potential. And of course, so much meaning.
Every man carries a circle of hell around his head like a halo. Every man has to go through hell to reach his paradise.
As for me, I've always thought it odd that Cathars had no concept of Gnosis. That they were basically neo-Manichaeans with Catholic clothing, when all Gnostic sects, fiercely individualistic and often infighting, always change their ethos beyond the 4 cornerstones I mentioned in my article, Gnostic Themes in Fight Club. In the end, I still got my punk rock, emo boys, the Sethians and Manichaeans.
Like all misunderstood rebels, he feeds on hypocrisy and black coffee to help with his morning dumps.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. In 2015, the audience is the largest it's ever been since the beginning of the show. But somehow donations, Patreon, and subscriptions are the lowest in years. Your support keeps this red pill cafeteria open and gives voice to exemplars like Mark that abet humanity out of the static mud of perceived history. Much appreciation to you shining crazy diamonds who assist me on a weekly basis. We've only just begun after 9 years, as we continue with this eternal soundtrack of the counterculture. And we're gonna do so many wonders together. I just know it. I just know it.
How can a man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?
How about we end with this quote by Giordano Bruno, who in the 16th century was already talking about physics. And it has to do with our soul's adventure through many worlds, many realities, and even so many histories, as we seek the warm embrace of Hagia Sophia. And it was gladly forwarded to me by my friend Jim. I can imagine an infinite numbers of worlds, like the earth, with a Garden of Eden on each one. In all these Gardens of Eden, half the Adams and Eves will not eat the fruit of knowledge, but half will. But half of infinity is infinity. So an infinite number of worlds will fall from grace, and there will be an infinite number of crucifixions. Therefore, either there is one unique Jesus who goes from one world to another, or there are an infinite number of Jesuses. Since a single Jesus visiting an infinite number of earths, one at a time, would take an infinite amount of time, there must be an infinite number of Jesuses. Therefore, God must create an infinite number of Christs. And here we are, my beloved truth seekers.
Sometimes the devil allows people to live a life free of trouble because he doesn't want them turning to God. Their sin is like a jail cell, except it's all nice and comfy and there doesn't seem to be any need to leave. The door's wide open. Till one day, time runs out. The cell door slams shut. And suddenly, it's too late.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Mark Gregory Pegg. How are you doing today, Mark?
I'm great, thanks.
Well, thanks for joining Aeon Byte, and as I mentioned, I really enjoyed your paper at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference. So we have that as the subject. Tell us about your thesis and what you talked about at the conference.
Right. At the conference, well, I have to say, when I was initially invited to the conference, I wasn't very quite clear what the conference was about, to be perfectly honest, and how it was being framed, particularly as I ended up, I was actually the only historian there. So it was an odd conference. It used history, but it wasn't clear how things were being approached. But part of why I was certainly invited is because my specialty is working on heresy in the Middle Ages. And there's often an argument that there's a Gnostic undercurrent, particularly throughout the medieval world, and going anywhere from say 400 to even 1500. And most famously, it's meant to be in one of the supposedly the most famous heretics in the Middle Ages, the Cathars. And the paper I gave and my recent work is basically pointing out that the Cathars never existed, that the most famous heresy in the Middle Ages is a complete invention of late 19th century historians. And I think this is a fascinating problem and question about, therefore, what does it mean to study, therefore, heresy and the people accused of heresy, particularly in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. So that's sort of the simple answer. That's what the paper was about. It was about the methodology of creating the question of heresy and religion by great scholars in the late 19th century, who basically invented Catharism in the same way that in many ways Gnosticism was invented, I think, as a category by scholars in the late 19th century, in the same way Hinduism was invented,
right.
In the same way, in many ways, paganism, but also, for want of a better word, so was at least this scholarly study of what it means to talk about Christianity. And particularly for my field, scholars invented, particularly German scholars with Religiongeschichte, they invented really the field of what it is to study religion. And so I think the question of, therefore, heresy, particularly Catharism, is integral to the very nature of the scholarly creation of a field of what it is to study religion and therefore study it through time. So that's essentially, in a short answer, what the paper's about. Is that clear, or do you want to ask me more about, clarify the paper?
Was this something that you slowly came to realize, or was it more or less of a bolt of lightning that came out? Because you have written a book on the Albigensians. You wrote on the Cathars, the Albigensians, and Good Men of Languedoc.
I've written a few books.
Right.
I've certainly written about the Albigensian Crusade, and I've written about the early Inquisitions, and I've just finished a big book on the whole medieval world from 200 to 1500. But yes, it wasn't so much, it was a slowish build-up over the last decade trying to grasp exactly this phenomenon, even though I have to admit, when I initially went back and was looking at the actual original sources from particularly the early Inquisition records from the 13th century, it didn't match. Completely didn't match anything that the scholarship has said about these Cathars, about supposedly, whether you want to say secret knowledge, the whole sort of mystical creation of what medieval heresy is meant to be. No evidence whatsoever. And the irony, the fascinating thing is there is no evidence for it. It's a complete, and in many ways, brilliant fabrication by late 19th century scholars piecing together from bits and pieces this sort of counter-church that the evidence just does not... there's no evidence for it. Therefore, that makes it even more, I think, fascinating, disturbing. Therefore, what does it mean that the medieval church itself accused people of heresy, therefore wages the first holy war against other Christians, which is the Albigensian Crusade, the first holy war in which other Christians were guaranteed salvation by killing other Christians, and that's 1208. And then you have the Inquisitions in 1230, 1233, when they begin again against people accused of heresy, and in many ways what I think is fascinating, and this is a tangled relationship, if you like, is that the medieval church itself creates the category of heresy and creates individuals as heretics, which is distinctly different than the late 19th century creation, but the two things get mangled together. So it's I would actually argue, and no, I'm not the only one to say this, in the last decade it's become perhaps one of the most exciting and volatile fields within our, certainly, history, is this question of the study of heresy, the study of persecution, simply because scholars such as myself have just said, look, the most famous heresy of the Middle Ages just never existed. And if it doesn't exist, then you have to rewrite the history of Christianity. You have to write the history of the medieval world and the history of Christianity.
Oh, I agree. And in layman's terms, for people who might be interested in this, is it as simple as there were once upon a time, these sort of liberal Catholics who call themselves the good men and women, who happened to possess a lot of very wealthy land, and somebody just went after it and created this whole thing of heresy? Is it as simple as that, Mark, or is it more complicated?
It's more complicated. No, it's actually not. It's actually more complicated than that. It's a fair question to ask, because I think that's been sometimes one of the assumptions about it. It's more that, and this is one of the things that's only come into play clear. This is something that's only been clearer for me, is that certainly in the 12th century, the great fear of the medieval church becomes heresy. Right? It's the great metaphor of like, it's a cancer, it's a leprosy eating away at the heart of Christendom. But you only find it as an accusation. It first begins as an accusation in the schoolroom, right? The great intellectuals of the 12th century throw it around at each other. I mean, part of the phenomena here is, in the 12th century, is that the medieval church itself wants, if you, for want of a better word, wants heresies, because that allows it to say it's the same church that goes all the way back to, say, Constantine the Great, in the 4th century, and so forth and so on. So, therefore we have Manichaeans in the same way that Augustine of Hippo talked about Manichaeans, in the 4th century or something. So there's a deliberate historical creation of this continuity of the church that the 12th century church is doing, the medieval church is doing. And that's also when they also start reading like Irenaeus of Lyon. They sort of start seeing some Gnostic connections, but really they never talk about Gnosticism in that sense. They talk about Manichaeans and Arians and so forth and so on. But what I only realize is that despite these powerful accusations, it was the call for the crusade in 1208. And more people were the call for crusade appealed to more ordinary Christians, if you like, who decided when Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, said basically that the Count of Toulouse, his lands were full of, he said, mercenaries and heretics, and they're polluting this land, and it's going to eat away Christendom, and he can't get rid of them, so I give you permission to go in and invade. It's like, he said, it's like going to Jerusalem. You have all the same rights as going to Jerusalem, like in the First Crusade, Second and Third and Fourth. And more people go on crusade. The appeal, the idea that you can go on crusading within Latin Christendom was more appealing. And I would argue that within a few short years, because of the great violence of the early years of the crusade, and it goes for like 20 years, 21 years, it ends in 1229, and then with the rise of Inquisition, that's when we start saying, if you like, these categories of who these heretics were. Now, the question you're asking, who are these people accused of heresy? Right. Yes, there is something distinctly different about the world that, let's just call it, between the Garonne and Rhone rivers, or the lands of the Count of Toulouse. The papacy called it Provincia, which is better translated as just province. Like they thought it was like the oldest Roman province. Yes, they were the good men and women, is often the name, but there wasn't, let's get this straight, there was no heresy of the good men and women in the 12th century. This is an easy mistake that people have confused about, say, my work and, say, the work of a great scholar like R.I. Moore, is that I would actually argue there were no heretics in the 12th century. There were accusations of heresy, and that's not the same thing. And none of these people thought of themselves as heretics. They weren't marginal people. They weren't on the edge of society. They weren't secretive. They were like integral, ordinary Christians. I would even argue thinking themselves as quite orthodox, integrated within the society, very much assuming their day-to-day activities, that holiness was something they could achieve in their day-to-day activities. And so what you end up having is, but at the same time, there's an incredible intellectual edifice being created by Latin Christian intellectuals, right? Church intellectuals, that basically is saying, no, only the church gets to decide what holiness means. Only the church decides the relationship of heaven and earth. Only the church decides, the relationship of the human and the divine. And remember, this is also the same period when they're starting to create that whole notion that what humans share with Christ is his humanity, and he shares our humanity, and through that we share his divinity. So there's this idea that the Imitatio Christi, that any ordinary person can actually be divine through just daily activity. It builds up, I would say, for 2 or 3 centuries. But I'd even argue these good men sort of believe that. I mean, that even comes out, you could argue, out of things like the First Crusade, with the idea that walking where Christ walked, you're actually being like Christ by going to the Holy Land. But now we're talking about the whole idea that you don't even have to go to Jerusalem to be like Christ, because we share this bond, which famously the same Pope, Innocent III, it's the first canon of the great, I think perhaps the most important church council in the history of Christianity, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. The first canon says that he shares our humanity and we share his divinity, and therefore we're bonded together. But that also, that leads. But these are quite powerful and sophisticated ideas, like the creation of purgatory as a concept, as the late 12th century. And I think a lot of ordinary Christians aren't going that way. So heresy very much is a powerful tool of the church, if you like, to create this idea of what it means to be Christian. And so that all ordinary Christians, and so it's like creating this model of what it is to be Christian, that basically, for want of a better word, that somebody could recognize what it is to be Christian, whether you're in London or Rome or, Venice or Toulouse. And I would actually argue that's not clear, certainly at the beginning of the High Middle Ages, say around 1100, and it's not really clear in 1200. It is by, say, 1400, but I think it takes 200 years of Inquisition and church doctrine and so forth and so on. So that's why I think heresy is a powerful tool that the church uses. And then, of course, then it becomes this powerful tool of persecution with Holy War and then the Inquisitions. But yeah, I mean, just basically, I would just say these people living in this world completely had an understanding of holiness, that ordinary people could be holy, that it was possible it was imitable. So it actually was a little bit like Imitatio Christi. They picked up those ideas. So it's not like some old pagan idea. In these little villages, and these were the good men. But people went to priests too. People assume you could go to a priest, you could go to these good men. It's sort of if you like, it's an understanding of, let's just say it's an understanding of religiosity that is powerfully tied to the social structure of these little villages and communities. And that's clearly antithetical to the notion of what religion's been created by the church in the 12th century, which is holiness and religion. For another word, a category of religion's been created that belongs to the church. That's who defines it. And so I do think there's this powerful tension that's there in the 12th century, and then it's completely, obviously, reshaped by persecution in the 13th century. And what's even more fascinating, you actually see people consciously choosing to be heretics, I argue, after 1250. People knowing full well that they're holding beliefs and doing things they may be killed for or persecuted for. So I do think there is a moment where people consciously choose to be heretics, but that's only after 21 years of Holy War, and then at least, I'd say, a decade or more, 2 decades of Inquisition. So I'm not at all denying that some people do consciously choose and think of themselves as heretics, but only after, say, 1250. This is why I think it's a fascinating problem, and to use even the conference or the question of Gnosticism, is that the debate about, as you obviously know, there's the debate about whether Gnosticism really existed or not. Okay, let's just assume the questions there, and I could go further about also part of my things about the methods we use to study religion. But, whether Gnosticism exists or not, for all intents and purposes, it makes no difference, say, whether Constantine the Great converted Christianity in 312. Whether Gnosticism exists or not, it sort of makes no difference, I would actually argue, to the path of history or the creation of a Christian Roman Empire. What it does make a difference is to lots of modern scholars, particularly religious studies scholars, in the sense of it shows there was potentially, or allows for, there was an alternative Christianity that we can find, we can resurrect, or, do you understand that there's potential that there may have been another path to Christianity? Or at least it allows modern scholars, particularly religious studies and theologians, to say, well, there's an alternative Christianity that never got created, that was never allowed to be created, and so on and so on. That's for me, that's like an exercise, therefore, in metaphysics, for want of a better word. It's a game of counterfactuals. You're always arguing, well, it could have happened if, so forth and so on. It actually doesn't change the course of world history in many ways. I don't think so. I don't think, as I said, I don't think the Roman Empire would have still Christianized and still would have Christianized in the way it probably did, whether Gnosticism existed or not. The difference with the Cathars is the fact they don't exist, nobody has ever, people who argue again for them still, and it's a model for 100 years. It's not a counterfactual. It's in that sense what a philosopher would call epistemology. It's actually about the study and knowledge of the way the world was. And if they don't exist, then we have to rewrite history. We have to rewrite, if you like, the whole history of mysticism, certainly, but the history of this kind of knowledge. And that's why I think it matters. But and I would also argue that it's also about the methods we use to study the past, really focusing on trying to grasp what ordinary people think is going on, as opposed to always studying basically high texts of philosophy or high texts of, there's this notion that was developed when religion became a category of study in the late 19th century for scholars, a powerful category from academic category, is that religion's only defined by doctrine. It's defined by clear-cut categories. It's defined by theology. It's defined by what intellectuals say it is. It's not at all defined by kind of how ordinary people act. And part of the trouble is it's because we don't often have documents from ordinary believers. And so it's a methodological problem. There's also a limitation. So the model itself doesn't always allow for that. But the question I would actually say is that there's lots of evidence out there. We just have to think differently. And I would say it's that evidence powerfully, let alone even the other evidence, that demonstrates that this most famous heresy just never existed. And that's where I think there's an interesting methodological question too about what we think religion means, how do we approach the study of it, and how do we create the categories that sort of, if nothing else, as religion's made a remarkable comeback in the last decade, I would actually argue, certainly in world history. I mean, it never left America, but it's made a huge comeback in world history. It does surprise me that the models we use to study it actually haven't got much further than, say, 1890 or 1900. I do. I think we in many ways, we've turned back to them. And that sort of, I find deeply disturbing. But anyhow.
Yeah, you even, as we talked at the conference, even mentioned that even the term dualism is a big red herring, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, I think it is. Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting, I mean, in many ways, dualism itself is part of this creation of what these intellectuals in the 12th century because basically what they're arguing is, they're arguing, like, for want of a better word, that heaven and earth is joined, body and soul are joined, right? Humanity and divinity, if you like, all humans have a flux within them of, like, their humanity and divinity. So there's a powerful idea that everything's joined. So what they come up with is a kind of, if you like, an anti-dualism, meaning that anybody who doesn't believe this new doctrine that the church is promoting has to be dualist. So all of a sudden, they create this kind of categories of dualism, to denounce almost anybody. But when you look at the categories that they keep using, they're totally incompatible, like incoherent. One minute it's like they don't believe in sex, next minute they're having orgies, the next minute or something they don't get married, but then we have evidence they do. People do get married who are accused of heretic. So it's an interesting and odd intellect. It's a theological category created in the 12th century. There's no question that by the end of the 13th into the 14th, I think you could argue there are some people who choose to be heretics who actually may fit the model of dualism, but I even think it's kind of, we're being too philosophically rigid about what they think it means in the sense of a kind of Manichaean dualism. But yeah, it's still another. I mean, what fascinates me is it doesn't mean it doesn't exist as a creation of these intellectuals of the Middle Ages. It just means it didn't exist as reality amongst ordinary people who get accused of it, or that scholars want to say it means it's out there. And that's what I find fascinating, and obviously I find problematic. But it's like, if we set categories, when scholars sort of say what dualism means, it's, you can find almost anything. I mean, in many ways, that's what I found a little problematic about the conference, is that the category of Gnosticism was so elastic and so amorphous and so almost ill-defined that almost anything could be defined as Gnostic. Well, it's true. We go from the 2nd century to, like, spaceships and, as Nation of Islam religion. I mean, what it was, and that the Nation of Islam is a Gnostic religion. That's just, which I found deeply unconvincing, but it's a game of counterfactuals. It's what we would possibly like the world to be. So it's very much an exercise in metaphysics, I thought, most of the papers at the conference. Not history, even though they were often pretending to be historians. It was really an exercise in metaphysical speculation about reframing what they would like certain things to be understood as. Now, that's all well and good, but it's very hard to prove, and it just really becomes what a scholar would like things to be, not evidence of what they are.
And as you said, Mark, and very well said so far, but you also said that if we do have any sort of evidence of this sort of neo-Manichaean group, we could go back to the Bogomils. You see them as more realistic than the Cathars, don't you?
I mean, I should preface before if someone ever says, I mean, the word Cathar there were some heretics called Cathars. I'm talking about this creation of this whole model of Catharism, which is meant to be an international church from across Eurasia, even, but it's certainly related to the Bogomils. I mean, what we had, even in the Council of Nicaea, there are some heretics or schismatics referred to as Cathars. So it's a very old word, but it's bizarrely enough, it's rarely used in Middle Ages. It's only used in very specific instances, I would actually argue, to mean like the Council of Nicaea used it, meaning people who may return to the faith. You find some Italian inquisitors using it in the 13th century, but the so-called famous heartland, right, which is where the Albigen's Crusade and what's now southern France, never used. No one uses it. Even inquisitors don't use it, and it does matter what words are used. Now, the Bogomils are more interesting in the sense of it clearly seems to be there was a Bogomil. There clearly seems to have been a group maybe in the 9th century that went by this category. But as to whether there really were Bogomil missionaries wandering through 11th century Latin Christendom, which has been argued, even though scholars who argue it say, well, we have no evidence, it just seems as though that must be the only way these ideas could have got there. These ideas, they themselves want to say are there. I'm not totally convinced. And a lot of scholars who work on this topic have actually, a lot of scholars who work on, say, the Byzantine Empire have even said, one could write quite clearly a history of the Byzantine Empire and never mention the Bogomils. It's sort of, they've become, again, I would actually argue because of late 19th century and 20th century scholarship, they've become more prominent than I think they ever were because of this desire to make connections across the Mediterranean between seemingly dualist ideas or that somehow these ideas must be connected because they seem similar, even though there's no, in many ways it's a very flawed mythological argument, which is that if two ideas look the same, then there must be a connection. But that's deeply, problematic and totally unproven, and not very, and I actually think deeply weak and flawed model of how you understand ideas. It actually is quite a common one in the history of ideas or intellectual history, but I think it's deeply problematic because that's really just a scholar finding similarities between ideas. And you can find, as the philosopher Nelson Goodman said, anything can be similar to anything else. So you can always find something that looks similar to something. So it actually isn't a good, lucid category of research. And yet that's the only way that the Bogomils get connected to Western Christendom. Again, it's problematic. Were they that influential in the Byzantine Empire? I'm not that convinced. The Byzantines themselves were very fond of having lists of heretics themselves, and so the Bogomils often featured in those lists. Again,
the Paulinists or somebody.
The Paulicians, right? The Paulicians. Once upon a time, there used to be. It's even amongst those who believe in the Cathars, it's died out. But I'd say until at least the 60s, it used to be a powerful argument that the Paulicians were clearly the descendants of the Cathars were clearly descendants of the Paulicians. Though that seems, even amongst those who want to argue for Cathars, to have died out. Though I wouldn't be surprised it's making a comeback, because there's a kind of crude comeback where people want to say, well, maybe they really are Manichaeans who never went away from the 2nd or 3rd century, which is sort of what some of these great scholars around 1900 wanted to argue. And obviously there's a very famous book by Stephen Runciman that argues that, the Medieval Menarche, and he was a great scholar of the Byzantine Empire, but I think the book's wrong. So no, these are interesting questions, but I think what I find disturbing is when people think, well, if we're just getting rid of all these, I actually think it makes it more interesting. I think it makes it more profound, because we're trying to therefore work out how categories of people, particularly we're trying to work out how an accusation leaves the classroom, for want of a better word, in Latin Christendom. Not only that it leaves the classroom, but then it actually ends up justifying and promoting the wholesale slaughter of men, women, and children for 21 years, and then the rise of the Inquisition. And that, to me, is more profound and disturbing, particularly than just saying, well, obviously it was because they were Cathars, or there was a counter church that threatened the church, the Catholic Church, the Roman Church. By the way, I should say that even if I think the church invents heresy, it doesn't mean I don't think they believed in it. This is not a conspiracy. I think they really believed in the very things they were inventing. What's fascinating is when the very things they invent actually come to shape the lives of real people. And I think, as I said, that takes holy war and Inquisition to do that. But no, I'm not convinced of the links between the Bogomils in the East. I'm not at all convinced, because, as I told you, it's only based on what I just said to you. It's totally only based on these ideas look the same, therefore there must be a connection. And that's not a very good argument for me. That's in fact that's not even an argument as far as I'm concerned, but it's a deeply weak argument. And it's not even clear the Bogomils were that influential or that power or that sort of pervasive, certainly by the 11th and 12th centuries, even if they ever were. So I mean, it is lack of evidence. The Byzantine Empire doesn't. For instance, it doesn't have Inquisition record. There was no Inquisition amongst Greek Christianity. So certain kinds of documents we have are the Latin West do not exist for the Greek East. So, it's the same. It's one of those bigger questions about, you could say, Middle Eastern medieval history, which is really what we only have are histories and chronicles. The same thing applies to the history of Islam. Histories, chronicles, lucid texts, maybe sermons, but we have none of the sort of documents like records of people being interrogated like we have for the Latin West. So there's a kind of again, we get back to methodology, we get back to the kind of approaches that some scholars only try, that I do think limits, if you like, the avenues of thought that people think you could possibly imagine what's going on, say, in the Middle East, let alone what's going on in the Latin West. So I think these are big questions. I mean, big questions about method, big questions about what you think makes religion, what you think you're searching for when you study for it. I say this as a historian, and particularly as a historian trained in America. You can tell I've got an accent. The accent's Australian. I went to graduate school in America, and I take very seriously I was trained in America. But American history, not just medieval history, but American history, coming out of the German model, not the German model of study of religion, but coming out of the German model of von Ranke, had no interest in religion. That's sort of part of the interesting phenomenon here about, if you could see, which I do think is sort of, you could say, also relates to some of these bigger issues, is that only at best the 70s and then maybe a little bit in the 80s, but really only since the late 90s and the 2000s has it actually become a topic that historians actually study. Part of it was just, American historians for more than 100 years just thought it can't be studied objectively. That's not what we do. And so that's just not what you'll find. Historians in America and Germany, but particularly in America, just didn't study. It was like something that was done in religious studies departments, maybe. And they didn't even exist until really the 70s. Religion was not something that was sort of taken seriously as a field of study. Theology, yes, not something you studied within the academy. And so I would argue that even then, I'd say some of the methods and insights that we could make, certainly I'll just talk about the medieval past, are held back by sort of this, for want of a better word, not being one of the major topics of methodological sophistication within the field, because it just wasn't studied for more than 100 years, or thought as though something that you could approach. It was something you took for granted. You sort of, yes, you sort of say, oh, yes, Catholics, Jews, Christian, whatever, but you didn't really analyze it deeply. At best, sometimes you thought it was like counting up church. You'd count up like church graveyards, or you'd count up how many lots of land a diocese owned. It was all very institutional. The study of religion for historians was like institutional history. Maybe it was intellectual history sometimes. So then you studied these great thinkers, but it wasn't something you necessarily investigated. So I do think that's very much a new thing, and that's why I think the field itself, what I say, is going through turmoil at the moment, because it's sort of all these questions relate to sort of overturning old methods, or what are the methods we're using. That's why I think people have gone back to the late 19th century, because they're like, they're clinging to they want methods, but they're not sure what to do now. I would actually argue. And I'm not sure religious studies is helping anyone at the moment. they've gone off on their own tangent, which is less, I have to say, less historically inclined than I would like. As I would say, many of the papers at that conference were. They talked about history, but that doesn't make them historical.
So to summarize, basically what we have is something akin to the Rosicrucian. It was some pious fiction, and the German people embraced it for some romance, and it was a good thing in certain respects. That's what happened to the Cathars. It's sort of, the creation was a blow, but like the Southern people really embrace it. 19th century occultists romanticize it.
Oh, God, yeah, absolutely.
Here we are.
It was this is what's so fascinating. It was very much a serious creation by great scholars in the late 19th century. And oddly enough, by a lot of French dry facade scholars. So part of it, it was like a model, like there was like an alternative France for them that was less clerical, that sort of could have been something. So it's interesting that many of the great French scholars who helped create Catharism around 1900 were powerfully, supporters of Dreyfus. But you're absolutely right, though. What's fascinating is that not so much the late 19th century, though it's coming, or 1900, but after the Second World War, the Cathars absolutely get woven in to the sort of the romantic occultism that particularly powerful after the First World War, the Rosicrucian. I mean, it's like that's why you get the Da Vinci Code. That's why they're in the Da Vinci Code. The Cathars.
Right.
But that's very much part of it is a late 19th century sort of that sort of occult creation, but really it's a creation of the post First World War, like the Aleister Crowley types. That sort of that kind of weaving together of a mysticism that involves Cathars and secret knowledge. I mean, this is why you end up with weirdly, now you've said that, you often end up with two sides of the debate about Cathars, completely separate to me, meaning that you often find quite sincere Catholic historians, old Catholic scholars, saying, well, no, the church generally was threatened. And that's why, and Catharism has to be this counter-church with this widespread series of deities that's really threatening the church and so forth and so on. It has to be a counter-church. And the church didn't mean to wage crusade and inquisition, but it had to. It was threatened, right? The other side I've come across is people who want to say, the church did it because the Cathars had secret knowledge, and therefore they had to persecute this secret knowledge. So paradoxically, you can get quite New Agey types wanting to believe in Catharism, as well as quite well-meaning, not always conservative, but well-meaning Catholic scholars and conservatives, mostly conservative, wanting to believe in that too. So two sides of the spectrum often want to believe that that Catharism had to exist for various reasons, and that's in that sense that kind of what we've just the older one. You find some Catholic scholars even around 1900 using the word Cathar as a justification that the church was threatened. They're more rare, actually. Much of this kind of stuff is post First World War, and that moment of sort of, as you know, the great sort of the belief in the particularly the mysticism, the occultism of after the First World War, which were deeply medievalist, was deeply imbued in much medieval history, but also medievalism after the First World War. So I think heresy and other issues get woven into that. I mean, this is why I think all these issues are kind of profound and fascinating, but it doesn't mean that's what's actually happening in the medieval past, if that's what we're talking about. I find the moment between 1870, say, and 1930 a deep, fascinating moment in scholarship about the creation of all these things. I just wish more scholars were aware of it and realize that's what's going on, that they're actually defending something that was created 100 years ago, not something that actually existed, say, between 1100 and 1300, which is one of the arguments. So I think that's a really fascinating and profound question and problem.
I've always thought it odd that I'm a lay historian and so forth, but it's obvious that you should have something like primary text. We found the Gospel of Truth, we can believe Irenaeus, but there is no Gospel of Guillaume Belabeste or anything like that.
Well, no, you're right, it's not. No, and what scholars end up doing is they end up saying, well, what we have are extracts here and there in maybe some Inquisition testimonies. Or what I do like, my favorite is, well, we've lost the books, but they must have existed. Now, the question is, as you can imagine, in the medieval, studying the Middle Ages, we actually have often lost lots of things, right? I mean, it is possible we can lose things. But this is an instance where I don't think the things that people want to argue are lost ever existed to begin with. It's only because, as I told you, that model of what makes a church or what makes a religion. A religion must have books. A religion must have texts. And the question is, these people who are accused of heresy in the late 12th century, these good men and these good women, they weren't a religion. That's the whole point. They weren't a religion. We may use words like they were religious, if you like, or they had a certain religiosity. I'd prefer, I think, holiness about them. But it wasn't antithetical to the church. It was part of the world in which they lived. As I said, people still went to them and priests. What I do think is fascinating is that what we see by about 1250 is that what the Inquisitors have done, as well as, by this stage we've got the Mendicant orders have been founded, Franciscans, Dominicans. And the Dominicans obviously are founded, the Order of Friars Preachers, specifically founded by Dominic to actually preach against heresy in southern France, right? They're actually called heretici provinciales, like just Provençal heretics. That's the usual name they're given, or just heretics. But what is interesting is that what the Inquisitors powerfully do, particularly Dominicans, and the Inquisition is largely staffed by Dominicans for the first 50 or 60 years, they actually take, should we say, all these ordinary behaviors that people had in life, right? So, like, one of the biggest inquisitions, actually the biggest inquisition in the Middle Ages takes place around 1245, 1246, 6,000 people in 200 days, right? This world. And what these inquisitors do is that, they take lots of testimonies, and people talk about their lives and all this, these good men and women, and the Inquisition, if you like, crafts a model of what these people have done and, if you like, creates a religion. But in creating a religion, they therefore create a heresy. And that's a sort of interesting thing, is how they themselves are almost working like, they're crafting from these testimonies what they think the testimonies mean, what they think these people's lives mean. And I should point out, this is also easily forgotten about the question of dualism too, is that that also presupposes usually the question of dualism, a linear sense of self, meaning a sense of self that you and I'm assuming, think about ourselves, meaning that you are in some sense related to yourself as a child, right? That you at 10 has some relationship to you now. Well, that's not natural. That's not a natural way of thinking about yourself. It takes a lot of work, and that's really, in many ways, a creation of the late 12th into the 13th centuries. And I'd even say powerfully the Inquisition. I mean, again, that Fourth Lateran Council says famously in Canon 21 that all Christians have to confess once a year. But that takes a long time to really permeate the idea that you talk about yourself. And you actually see this sort of phenomena going on here, that the Inquisition, as it creates heresy, it's also telling people that things they thought were innocent, or things that they did 30 or 40 years ago, no, that all this stuff is now created and relates to each other. So that's also part of the phenomena that's going on here, is that in the creation of heresy, you're also creating very much a new sense of what makes a person, a new sense of self, which is, if you like, that there's no such thing. If you like, they almost erase innocence from the world, but there's nothing that you've ever done in looking back that you can't be asked about. And that's a huge shift, and that's in the 13th century. It's this creation of, I won't say modern, but it is where our, shall we say, modern sense of self comes from. It is this creation of the 13th century, and particularly Inquisitors, and related to heresy. I mean, that's the thing. You will not find, it's not natural to think about ourselves this way. And you'll find much of the early medieval world, people don't think about themselves that way. They don't think of themselves in that linear sensibility. As in, I would say, people before the Aboriginal Crusade in this world didn't think like that too. And I should say, remember, this is the world of the troubadours, the troubadour poetry. Troubadour poetry doesn't think of this person or people in this kind of linear sense either. So all these issues get powerfully, I think, related. And I think they're quite profound questions, but it's all tied into persecution, the creation of heresy, what it is to transform ordinary people and their ordinary behavior into things that have huge consequences that they wouldn't have even guessed. And, it's sort of, not surprising, it's the same era when we get our first form of word ghosts in Western culture, the idea, because what we're talking about is continuity of life after death, but you are the same person in death. And that's pretty much a new idea too. Otherwise purgatory makes no sense, because purgatory is the same as it's our time. It's our time in purgatory, and that it's debated, but most scholars accept that is also a creation of the 12th century amongst these intellectuals. And so, what we're creating here is this idea that our identity, if you like, the identity of people is continuous from child to adult, and in death it's continuous as well, and that's all related to these issues. And I do think that's. And that's why I think it's so problematic. That's why, and I would argue that people who don't get that, which I'd say is most Christians, most people in what was Latin Christian, that's why they get accused of being dualists. Because dualism is a belief that you, at least as these intellectuals frame it, is that you don't understand, a linear sense of yourself, that kind of stuff. Do you see what I mean? So, this is, I don't know. I'm sort of raving on, but what I'm trying to say is that, it's not an inconsequential question to say that the most famous heresy never existed. It really means rewriting so much of the history of the medieval world, but really the history of Christianity. And I'm not at all pretending it's not disputed. I'm not pretending it's not controversial. But that's where your previous question. Yes, I've been thinking about this for a long time and perfecting and smoothing out my argument. Largely because of people either not getting it or disagreeing with me or so forth and so on. And so in that sense, disagreement has been useful. But I'm pretty convinced and sure of it now. Not convinced. I know I find it irrefutable myself. The evidence just seems so overwhelming. And there you go. I'm finishing a short book on that this summer. So, and obviously it'll be a paper for the conference.
Yes, and we certainly look forward to this book, and I certainly look forward to being able to listen to another of your papers. But I think that's all the time we have today, Mark. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and giving us a very stimulating conversation.
Well, I hope it all made sense.